And before we can integrate users into our application, let's go ahead and finish building it out, which is going to be the goal of this video. We have 3 more methods to add and test. The first one is remove user, which is going to take an argument, the ID of the user you want to remove. This is also going to return the user that was just removed. So if I remove the user with an ID of 3, I want to get rid of it from this list, but I do want to return the object. We'll leave a little note about that right here. Return user that was removed. Awesome. Now the next method that we're going to be filling out is get user. Get user is going to take the exact same arguments as remove user. We're going to find a user by ID, returning the user object, but we're not going to be removing it from the array. Now the final one that we're going to create as specified up above is a method called get user list. This is going to get a list of all the users, just their names, by the room name, which means that we're going to iterate through the users array, looking for all the users whose room matches the room specified. Perfect. This is going to return an array, something like this: Mike, Jen, Caleb, assuming those are the people inside of the room. Now notice here we're not specifying the room or the ID property, we're just returning an array of strings. Awesome. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and add one thing to our test file. In order to get these methods to work, we're going to need seed data. We're going to need users that already exist. Otherwise, we can't remove one, we can't get one, and we definitely can't get a list of the rooms these non-existent users are in. In order to fix that, over inside of user.test.js, we're going to add a before each call, which we've used in the past. Before each, as we know, is going to get called before every single test case. It's going to help us initialize some data. Now the data we're going to initialize is going to be defined just above in a variable called users. And the reason I'm defining it outside of before each is so it's accessible inside of before each, and it's accessible inside of the test cases down below. Inside of before each, we're going to set users equal to new users, and we're also going to set the users array. Right here, we can specify an array of objects, and this is going to let us add some initializing data. Let's go ahead and provide 3. The first one will have an ID equal to 1. We'll set the name equal to something like Mike. And we can go ahead and set the room equal to whatever we like. I'm going to go ahead and use a room name of node course. We can take this object and copy it 2 more times. I'm going to add a comma, paste in what I just copied, and do the same thing again, comma followed by a paste. I'm going to change it to an ID of 2 for the second user. We'll change the name to something like Jen, and we'll change the room name to React course. Now for the last user, we are going to change the ID and the name. We'll make the ID 3, and we'll make the name something like Julie, but we're going to leave the room as node course so we can test that our getUserList function does indeed return the correct results. The test cases aren't going to be required to use our users variable as defined here. We can still define a custom one like we do down below. If I run the test watch script, npm run test-watch, we're going to see that our one test case is still passing. I'm going to save the file to rerun the test suite, and right here we have 6 passing test cases. Regardless of whether or not we use this, we can still use a custom one like we do here. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and start filling out some of these methods. We're going to fill out getUserList together, and you're going to be responsible for remove user and get user. Now, in order to fill out getUserList, we're going to start by finding all of the users whose room matches the room argument specified here. In order to do that, we're going to use the filter method on arrays, which we've used in the past. Let's make a variable. We'll call it users, and we'll set it equal to this dot users, which is the array of users, dot filter. Now, if you remember, filter takes a function as its argument. This function gets called with each individual user. We can return true to keep this item in the array, or we can return false to have it removed from the array. Right here, I'm going to go ahead and return, and we're going to return user.room, and we're going to check if that equals, using 3 equal signs, the room argument. If they are equal, this is going to result in true. That value will get returned. If they're not equal, it's going to result in false, and the user will not be added to the list above. Now we can go ahead and use the shortcut for our ES6 arrow function. Instead of adding the return keyword here and specifying the actual arrow, we'll use the shorthand like this. Exact same functionality, just a different technique. Now that we have this in place, we have a list of all the users who do match the criteria. The next step in the process is to take that array of objects and convert it to an array of strings. All we care about is getting that list of names. In order to do that, we're going to use map. Right here, I'm going to create a variable called namesArray, and we're going to set this equal to users.map. Now, we have used map in the past. As we know, map also takes a function similar to filter. It also gets called with the individual item, in this case, an individual user, but map lets us return the value we want to use instead. So we're going to get an object in here. This is going to have the ID property, the room property, and the name property, and all we want is the name property. So we're going to return user.name. And we can simplify that even further using the shorthand for the arrow function. User.name right here is going to be implicitly returned. Now that we have our names array, all we need to do is go ahead and return it by returning names array. Now this is going to get the job done. Before we simplify it any further, let's go ahead and write a test case to make sure it works. Inside of users.test.js, we can get this done below our other test case. It should return names for node course. Right here, we're going to write a test case that returns all of the users inside of the node course. We should get the two users back, Mike and Julie. Right here, we'll make a variable. We'll call that variable user list. And what we're going to do is call the users variable defined up here. This is the one with our seed data. We do not need to create a custom one like we do for the other test case. Users.getUserList. And we know getUserList takes one argument, the name of the room you want to fetch the list for. This one is called node space course. Make sure your capitalization lines up. Then we can go ahead and add a semicolon at the end. The last thing to do is add our assertion, making sure that what we get back is what's expected. Right here, we'll expect that the user list equals, using toEqual, the following array. It's going to be an array where the first item is Mike and the second item is Julie. If that assertion passes, we know getUserList worked as expected because that's exactly what we have defined up above. Now we can go ahead and copy this test case, doing the exact same thing for the React course. Should return names for React course. We'll change node to React, and we're going to go ahead and update what we expect. The React course has just one user. That user has a name equal to Jen. Now this is a pretty good test case. If we save users.test.js, it's going to rerun the entire test suite. We should see we have our 3 tests under the users described block, and they should all be passing. That is indeed the case. The next 2 methods that we're going to be creating, removeUser and getUser, are going to be yours to do as a challenge. I'd also like you to write some test cases that make sure they work as expected. Let's go ahead and write the it statements for the test cases together, and you'll be responsible for actually filling out the method and filling out the test case. Right here, it should remove a user. And this method is going to take the ID of one of our seed users, whether it's 1, 2, or 3. It's going to pass it to the function removeUser, and your job is going to be to assert that the user was indeed removed. Now, there really is no right or wrong way to make the assertions. If you find you do things a little differently than what I do as I go through the challenge at the end, that is perfectly fine. Next up, it should not remove user. In this case, I want you to pass in an ID that is not part of our seed user array. That means something like 44, 128, or basically any string that's not 1, 2, or 3. In this case, you should be asserting that the array has not changed. We should still have those 3 items. Now, those are the 2 test cases for our removeUser method. Next up is getUser. We're going to add 2 similar test cases. First up, it should find user. You should pass in a valid ID and you should get the user object back. And the other one is going to be it should not find user. Just like it should not remove a user, pass in an invalid ID and make sure you do not get a user object back. Now that you have this in place, you know what tests you need to fill out. Over inside of user.js, all you need to do is fill out these two functions, and I'll give you a hint. I used the filter method on the array extensively inside of both of these. The goal here is to search through the user's array, finding items with this ID. Now, there is no wrong way to do it. If you find you use something like lodash, underscore, another array method aside from filter, whatever it takes to get the job done, that is perfectly fine. Once you are done, go ahead and make sure everything is working as expected by rerunning the test suite. If you do see all of your tests passing, that's great. You can go ahead and click play. How'd you do? Hopefully you were able to fill out both of those methods and you were also able to get those test cases up and running. I'm going to start off with getUser. The goal here is to return the user object whose ID matches the ID of this argument. To get that done, I am going to be using filter. We're going to return the result from this.users.filter. Just like we do down below, we're going to be filtering by ID. Here we filter by room. We're going to pass in our arrow function using the expression syntax. The argument will be the user. And right here, we are going to go ahead and return true if the user's ID property equals the ID of the argument. If that is the case, we do want to keep this user in the array. And in the end, we should have just one user or 0 users. And all we're going to do is return the first item. If there's one user in the array, we're going to get its object back right here. If there's no users, we're going to get undefined, which is exactly what we want. Now that we have getUser in place, we can write the test case for that. We have 2 right here. It should find user and it should not find user. For it should find user, I'm going to get started by making a variable called user ID, and I'm going to set this equal to the ID I want to use. I need a valid ID, so I'm going to go ahead and use 2. 1, 2, or 3 would have worked here. Next up, I am going to go ahead and make a user variable. This is going to be the return result from getUser. I'll set it equal to users.getUser, and we're going to try to fetch a user whose ID is 2 by passing in user ID. Now, the next thing we're going to do is make an assertion about what we get back. We should have gotten our object back, and we can expect that user.ID equals using to be the ID up above, the user ID variable. I'm going to go ahead and save the test suite, and you can see all of our test cases are still passing, which is fantastic. If it does not equal the ID, maybe the ID is 3, you're going to see the test case fail, and we do get a pretty clear error message. We expected 2 to be 3, which clearly is not the case. This is the final test case, though, and we can move on to it should not find user. In this case, we're going to follow a very similar format, creating the user ID variable and setting it equal to a user ID that does not exist inside of our built-in users. Something like 99 would get the job done. Next up, we'll be making a user variable, once again, to store the return result from getUser, users.getUser, passing in our user ID. Now, in this case, we would expect that undefined comes back. Filter should return nothing, and if you try to fetch the first item in an empty array, you're going to get undefined. We can prove that over in the terminal by running node, and right here inside of our little console, we can create an empty array, and we can access the first item. What do we get back? We get back undefined. I'm going to shut that down, restart our test suite, and over here, we are going to go ahead and make our assertion. We're going to expect user to not exist. Perfect. I'm going to save the file, and all of our test cases should still be passing. They both are. That's great. Next up, we need to write the remove user method, and we also need to fill out the test cases. Over inside of user.js, we can get started by finding the user if any. That means we're going to use a similar technique to what we have right here. I'm going to actually copy this line and paste it just right here, creating a variable called user, setting it equal to what else but this. Now, you could also go ahead and actually call getUser. Right here, I could call this.getUser, passing in the ID just like this. Both of those solutions are going to work as expected. Next up, if there is a user, we want to remove it. If user, we're going to do something special in here, and regardless of whether or not a user did exist, we are going to return the value user. If it didn't exist, we're going to return undefined, which is great. If it did exist after we remove it, which is going to happen right here, we'll be returning the object, also what we want. All we need to do inside of here is figure out how to remove it from the list. To do this, I'm going to set this.users equal to this.users, and we're going to call filter, finding all users whose ID does not match the one specified up above. We're going to call filter, passing in our arrow function. We're going to get the individual user right here, and all we're going to do inside of our arrow expression syntax is add user.id does not equal ID. This is going to create a new array right here, setting it equal to this.users, and we're going to have the item removed, if any. If there was no item, that's fine. This statement is never going to run, and we'll be able to continue on returning undefined. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and write a test case that makes sure it works as expected. I'm going to save user.js, and right here, we're going to fill both of these out. Let's get started with should remove a user. I'm going to make a variable user ID to store the ideal ID, which would be 1, 2, or 3. I'll go with 1. Then we can go ahead and actually remove it, storing the return result in a user variable. I'm going to call users.removeUser, passing in my user ID variable, which is 1. Now that we have the potentially removed user, we should be able to go ahead and assert some stuff. We're going to expect that the user object exists. Right here, we're going to expect that its ID equals the ID we have up above. Expect that the user removed has an ID equal to, using to be, user ID. Awesome. Next up, we're going to make sure that the user was removed from the array. We're going to expect users.users.length to be, in this case, 2. It should have been 3 in the beginning, and once we removed a user, it should have been 2. Down below, we're going to do some similar stuff. We're just going to be tweaking the user ID. I can actually copy the contents of our first test case, paste it into the second one, and all we need to do is make a few tweaks. I'm going to change the ID to an invalid ID, like 99. We are still going to call remove user with the ID. In this case, though, instead of expecting the user to have an ID property, we're going to expect that user does not exist, using to not exist. Perfect. Next up, we're going to expect the length has not changed right here. We're going to make sure that the length still equals 3. Now I can go ahead and save the test file. This is going to restart everything inside of NodeMon, and what we should get is a test suite that's passing. It looks like it did already run, although the content didn't change, so it's a little hard to figure out if anything happened. I'm going to shut that down and run npm test just to verify, and right here you can see all 12 test cases are passing. And this is fantastic. We now have all of the methods we need to persist a user across the different event listeners. Whether they're sending a message, a location message, whether they're connecting or leaving, we're going to be able to keep track of them and send the right thing to the right people. The actual integration is coming up next, so stay tuned. I will see you then.